Oh, so that's what the password is. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Commander Guys gameplay video. We're back after an extended leave, and I'm excited to have content coming out again every Saturday. In short, we left because of a mix of my burnout, a lack of footage, and the general insanity going on in the entire world. But we've been able to pretty reliably capture footage again, and we'll be uploading games every Saturday once again. While we've been away, I've taken the time to learn a whole lot about video production, and that in turn caused me to make a whole bunch of changes to both our content and our channel. You'll notice a lot of the content changes throughout the video, but in addition, I revamped our Discord server. It's the best way to stay in touch with the community, including Devin and I. On top of that, I revamped our Patreon. We added tiers with various rewards, and all patrons now get access to gameplay videos up to a day early. Subscribe at the $5 tier, and you can join Morello here in our list of patrons, while helping support the growth of the channel. The links for both our Discord server and Patreon are down in the description. Also, while we were away, the Command Zone actually put out a video, which used our content, in combination with a couple other big channels, to help draw some conclusions on the format as a whole. You can check out that video here. Finally, while we were away, there were two major rule changes which happened. First off, Companion as a mechanic was reworked. Now at sorcery speed, you can pay 3 mana to put your Companion to hand. Aside from that, the rules to be able to set a card as your Companion remain unchanged. In addition, commanders now die or go to exile whenever relevant removal happens. From there, a state-based action allows you to move them to the command zone. The biggest impact of this change is that commanders now trigger death triggers when they die, even if you end up sending them to the command zone. That in turn means that commanders like these have received a slight buff. Alright, that's enough updates. Let's go ahead and jump in to the brand new player introductions. First off this week, we have Isabella, playing Zacama Primal Calamity. Her overall build focuses on dinosaurs, and uses Zacama's abilities to help close out games. She kept 3 forests, Charging Monstrosaur, Deathgorge Scavenger, Kadama's Reach, and Siegehorn Ceratops. Then comes Danny, piloting Bear Force 1. Ayula focuses on casting bears to build a board state. It has the option to either go wide or tall, thanks to Ayula's abilities. Danny kept Inspiring Call, Werebear, Vivian Champion of the Wilds, and 4 forests. Next up is Josh, playing his Vial Smasher-Ikra-Obosh deck. This deck runs Obosh as a companion, and as such is limited to odd mana costs only. He's looking to double down on various damage effects to slowly burn out each of his opponents, and he kept a pair of snow-covered forests, Command Tower, Seething Song, Painful Truths, Blasphemous Act, and Plague Wind. Last but not least, we have Oscar, playing Omnath, Locus of the Roil. His build focuses more on elementals, but also uses Wetnath himself as a value engine to power his other effects. Oscar kept Overgrowth Elemental, Rhythm of the Wild, Wooded Foothills, a pair of forests, an island, and a Temple of Mystery. Isabella, Danny, and Josh each drop a forest for their first turn, and then Oscar drops a tapped Temple of Mystery and scries away a card before passing off. Isabella drops another forest and casts a Llanowar Elves before passing turn. Danny drops another forest and casts his commander Ayula to close out his second turn. Josh drops a tapped Blood Crypt and casts a Birds of Paradise. He then passes turn. Oscar then closes out round 2 by dropping an island. Isabella drops a forest. She casts a Kodama's Reach and uses it to bring in a mountain tapped and a plains to hand before passing off. Danny drops a forest and casts Vivian, Champion of the Wilds. He upticks her and gives Ayula both Vigilance and Reach until his next turn. Danny then moves to combat and hits Oscar for 2 before passing off. Josh drops a command tower. He casts his commander Vial Smasher and passes turn. Oscar drops a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it and loses a total of 3 life to shock in a Stomping Ground. He follows this up with a Rhythm of the Wild and then passes off. Isabella drops a Plains. She casts a Siege Horde Ceratops and quickly follows it up with a Death Gorge Scavenger. As the Scavenger ETBs, she exiles her own Kodama's Reach, giving the Scavenger +1/+1 until end of turn, but not before moving to combat and hitting Oscar for 1. Danny drops a forest. He casts an Explosive Vegetation and uses it to bring in a pair of forests tapped. After that, he upticks Vivian and gives Ayula Vigilance and Reach once again. Danny then skips through combat and passes off to Josh. Josh drops a Verdant Catacombs and cracks it, losing a life, to bring in a tapped Overgrown Tomb. He then pays 3 mana to put Obosh to hand, before passing off to Oscar. Oscar drops a forest. He casts Wetnath, and as it ETBs, he pings down Josh's birds and gives Wetnath haste from Rhythm of the Wild. Oscar then moves to combat and swings Omnath at Josh for 3 before passing off. Isabella drops a Croissant Verge. She casts a Charging Monstrosaur and moves to combat. She swings the Monstrosaur at Oscar for 5 and then passes off to Danny. Danny drops another forest. He downticks Vivian and looks at the top 3 cards of his library before exiling one of them underneath Vivian. He swings Ayula at Oscar, and before damage happens, flashes in the Keeper of Fables he exiled with Vivian. Damage then happens, and Danny draws a card from Keeper before passing off. Josh drops a forest. He casts his companion Obosh, and randomly hits Danny for 5 thanks to Vial Smasher. Josh then skips through combat and passes turn. Oscar drops a Scalding Tarn and puts a +1/+1 counter onto Omnath. He cracks the Tarn and loses a life again to bring in a tapped Steam Vents. He follows this up by casting a Chandra's Triumph to deal 3 damage to Vial Smasher, before remembering his +1/+1 counter from when Steam Vents entered and passing off. Isabella casts a Godzilla King of the Monsters. She moves to combat and swings the Monstrosaur at Vivian for 5. In response to declaration of attackers, Danny flashes in Werebear, and as it ETBs, he adds an additional 2 +1/+1 counters to Ayula. Vivian then takes 5 and is destroyed as Isabella passes turn. Danny drops a forest. He casts a Beast Whisperer and follows it up with a Bear Cub. On cast, he draws a card from the Whisperer, and then on ETB, he adds 2 +1/+1 counters to the Cub thanks to Ayula. Unable to really break through anyone's defenses just yet, Danny passes off. Josh helps everyone at the table out by dropping an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. He casts a Painful Truths and spends 3 different colors of mana to do so. So as the spell resolves, he draws 3 cards and loses 3 life. Josh then enchants Oscar with the Curse of Opulence, and follows it up by casting a Blood Chief Ascension. And after all of that, Josh passes off. Oscar drops an island, and adds another +1/+1 counter to Omnath. He casts an Overgrowth Elemental, which adds another +1/+1 counter to Omnath as it ETBs. Oscar then passes off. Isabella casts a Raptor Hatchling. She follows up with Wayward Swordtooth, and descends on that cast. She then moves to combat, and swings a total of 12 damage at Danny. Danny blocks the Monstrosaur with Bear Cub, and Godzilla with Ayula. Then before damage, Danny casts an Inspiring Call. He draws 2 cards, and his creatures with +1/+1 counters gain indestructible until end of turn. Damage then resolves through, and a total of 4 damage tramples through to Danny. With nothing else this turn, Isabella passes off, as Josh adds another counter to Blood Chief Ascension. Danny drops Akaya's Cradle. He activates Cradle for 5, and then uses 3 of that mana to cast a Growing Rites of Itlamok. As Growing Rites ETBs, Danny looks at the top 4 cards of his library and reveals a Spectral Bears, which he puts to hand, and then immediately casts. He adds 2 counters to Ayula from that bear, before remembering his draw from Beast Whisperer. He then follows up with a Skyshroud Claim, which he uses to bring in a pair of forests untapped. After that, he warns his opponents of the grisly fate they're about to face. As the 2 tokens enter, Danny adds 2 more counters to Ayula, before having it fight Godzilla. After Godzilla dies, Danny moves to combat. He swings a single point of damage at Josh, and draws a card from Keeper of Fables. Danny then moves to end step, and transforms Growing Rites into what is effectively his second copy of Cradle on board, before passing turn. Josh drops a Forest. He casts a Blasphemous Act, which does a total of 26 damage to every creature on board. And as the board is wiped, Oscar gains a life from Overgrowth Elemental, as Isabella creates a 3/3 dinosaur. Josh then recasts Vial Smasher and passes off. Oscar drops a Forest. He casts Angry Nath, and chooses to give it haste from Riot. He then moves to combat, and hits Josh for 5 more, before passing off. Isabella moves straight to combat, and hits Danny for 3, before passing off. And at her end step, Josh puts another counter onto Blood Chief Ascension. Danny casts a Kadama's Reach, and uses it to bring in a Forest tapped, and 1 to hand. He recasts Ayula, and follows it up with a Garruk Caller of Beasts. He upticks Garruk, and reveals the top 5 cards of his library, before putting Thorn Mammoth and Pale Bears to hand. With nothing else this turn, Danny passes off. Josh drops an untapped Spire Garden. He casts a Painful Lesson targeting himself, and randomly deals 3 damage to Oscar on that cast. Josh then draws 2, and loses 2. He rituals with a Seething Song, and funnels the rest of his mana into a copy of the Great Henge. Josh then moves to combat, and swings Vial Smasher at Oscar. On that attack, he creates a treasure from Curse of Opulence. In main 2, Josh gains 2 life, as he casts the Treasure Nabber. Treasure Nabber then enters with a +1/+1 counter, and Josh draws a card, before adding a counter to Ascension at his end step, and passing turn. Oscar recasts Wetnath, and as it ETBs, he shocks Ayula, before giving Omnath haste from Riot. Oscar then drops a mountain, and draws a card from Wetnath, before missing his +1/+1 counter, and creating a 5/5 elemental from Angry Nath. He moves to combat, and hits Isabella for 8, before passing turn. Isabella casts an Odapek Huntmaster. She hits Danny for 3 more in combat, and passes off. Danny drops a Forest. He upticks Garuk, and reveals his top 5, but he only gets to put a Metallic Mimic to hand this time. He casts the Mimic, naming Bears, and then recasts Ayula again, which enters with a +1/+1 counter thanks to the Mimic. He follows this up with a Pale Bears, which gets a +1/+1 counter as well, before adding 2 more to Ayula. Danny then passes off. Josh gains 2 life, as he casts a Rise from the Dark Realms. He randomly deals 9 damage to Isabella on that cast, and then puts all creatures from all graveyards onto the battlefield under his control. This also triggers the Great Henge a total of 15 times, which ultimately means that each of the creatures Josh gets enters with a +1/+1 counter, as he draws a total of 15 cards. And then the following ETBs happen. Josh exiles Vivian with Deathwatch Scavenger, which gives itself an additional +1/+1. And Josh also ascends, thanks to Wayward Swordtooth. Josh then drops both a mountain and an Ancient Tomb, and takes a moment to look at his hand, before casting his Soul Ring. Josh then takes 2 damage to cast Dictate of the Twin Gods. He moves to combat, and swings the Monstrosaur at Oscar. Oscar doesn't want to take 20 damage, so he unsummons the Monstrosaur back to Isabella's hand. Josh then passes off, as he reminds Oscar of the 2 life that he lost from Unsummon hitting his graveyard. Oscar drops a Forest. This triggers both Omnaths, causing Oscar to place a +1/+1 counter, create a 5/5 elemental, and draw a card. He then casts a Farseek, which causes him to lose 2, as Josh gains 2, thanks to Bloodchief Ascension. Oscar brings in a tapped island with Farseek, and once again triggers both Omnaths. He then follows up with an unexpected results. And after cuts, he hits a Thicket Crasher, which he casts for free, before Bloodchief Ascension drains him for 2 more life. Oscar also chooses to give the Crasher haste with Rhythm of the Wild. He follows up with a Healer of the Glade, which gains haste as it ETBs, and also causes Oscar to gain 3 life. Oscar then moves to combat, and knowing that Josh likely wins on his next turn, decides to swing out in that direction. It's a total of 40 damage with Trample, and here's where the math starts to get really ugly thanks to Dictate of the Twin Gods. I'm going to talk more about how this combat step should have gone in the game review, but for now suffice it to say that this is less than optimal. It actually led to Josh incorrectly losing more creatures than he needed to. With how blockers were declared, the following steps end up happening. Josh gains a total of 9 life from Overgrowth Elemental, seeing his creatures dying. Then Bloodchief Ascension triggers a whole bunch, causing Oscar to lose 8, Isabella to lose 10, and Danny to lose 4. This in turn causes Josh to gain a total of 22 life. Then, Angry Nath's damage triggers resolve through, and Oscar deals 6 to 5 of Josh's creatures. This in turn triggers Bloodchief again, causing Danny to lose 4 more, and Oscar to lose 2 more, as Josh misses his life gain from Bloodchief Ascension. This also triggers Overgrowth Elemental, causing Josh to gain 4. Finally past all of that mess, Oscar casts a Leafkin Druid, and passes turn. Isabella recasts the Monstrosaur and moves to combat. She swings both of her dinos at Josh, who blocks with each of his available creatures. The same mistake from before happens again, and Josh ends up taking a total of 9 damage. We then account for Blood Chief, and Isabella loses 4, while Danny loses 2, and Josh gains a total of 6. With nothing else this turn, Isabella passes off. Danny adds a Rogue's Passage to a substantial pile of lands. He upticks Garruk again, and hits Eternal Witness, Grizzly Bears, and Ashcoat Bears. He then casts the Eternal Witness, and uses it to grab back Grizzly Fate before immediately casting it. This causes him to lose 2 to Blood Chiefs, while creating a total of 4 bears because he meets the threshold requirement, each of which enters with a +1/+1 counter. Ayula triggers 4 times, and he stacks an additional 8 counters onto her. Danny follows up with the Grizzly Bears, which enters with a +1/+1 counter, as Danny stacks more +1/+1s onto Pale Bears. Danny then moves to combat, and makes Pale Bears unblockable, before swinging Ayula at Josh, and Pale Bears at Oscar. And this damage eliminates both Josh and Oscar thanks to Dictate of the Twin Gods. In main 2, Danny casts a Shamanic Revelation. He remembers his treasure token from Curse of Opulence, before drawing 9 cards, and gaining 8 life thanks to Ferocious. Danny casts Brawn, and follows it up with a Vivian's Grizzly. The Grizzly gets a +1/+1 counter, and then Ayula has Pale Bears fight Brawn. And with that out of the way, Danny passes off. Isabella untaps, and hopes to top deck a board wipe. Unfortunately she doesn't, and now that she's out of options, she scoops it up, ultimately meaning that Bear Force won. I'm going to take this time to quickly explain the mistake from earlier. And long story short, once you've assigned damage, that assignment is locked in place for any multiplicative effects. For example, let's say you're attacking me with a 5/5 with Trample, and I block with a 0/4, well, Dictate of the Twin Gods is in play. You must assign 4 points of damage to kill my blocker, and from there you can assign the additional point of damage to either me or my creature. After damage has been assigned, the replacement affected Dictate applies and doubles all of the damage, and you do not get the chance to reassign any additional damage. So in the above example, 8 points of damage would go to my 0/4, while an additional 2 points of damage would trample through to me. And yeah, I know this whole situation got a little more complex with Godzilla in play, but it ultimately would have just changed how much damage needed to be assigned, not when it was assigned. Josh overcommitted on blockers against Oscar's attacks, and left himself open to a lot more damage than was necessary. So that's gonna do it for this video. Welcome to all the new players on the channel, and a huge thank you to everyone who has returned to record so far. Things are still very chaotic down in Southwest Florida, so it's been nice to have that support. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and make sure to subscribe to see more of our Commander content, or ring the bell to actually see our content. We're trying to hit 5,000 subs by the end of the year, so every single sub counts. Don't forget to join the conversation over on Discord, and to check out our newly revamped Patreon. Links for both, as well as deck lists for the game, are down in the description. I'll see you all next week with another gameplay video, and as always, thank you for watching.